Open source software is computer software with its source code made available with a license in which the copyright holder provides the rights to study, change, and distribute the software to anyone and for any purpose. Open source software may be developed in a collaborative public manner. Open source software is the most prominent example of open source development. The open source model, or collaborative competition development from multiple independent sources, generates an increasingly more diverse scope of design perspective than any one company is capable of developing and sustaining long-term. A report by the Standish Group states that adoption of open-source software models has resulted in savings of about $60 billion per year to consumers. History. End of 1990s. Foundation of the Open Source Initiative in 1997, Eric Raymond published The Cathedral and the Bazaar, a reflective analysis of the hacker community and free software principles. The paper received significant attention in early 1998, and was one factor in motivating Netscape Communications Corporation to release their popular Netscape Communicator Internet Suite as free software. This source code subsequently became the basis behind SeaMonkey, Mozilla Firefox, Thunderbird and Composer. Netscape's act prompted Raymond and others to look into how to bring the Free Software Foundation's free software ideas and perceived benefits to the commercial software industry. They concluded that FSF's social activism was not appealing to companies like Netscape, and looked for a way to rebrand the free software movement to emphasize the business potential of sharing and collaborating on software source code. The new term they chose was open source, which was soon adopted by Bruce Perens, publisher Tim O'Reilly, Linus Torvalds, and others. The Open Source Initiative was founded in February 1998 to encourage use of the new term and evangelize open source principles. While the Open Source Initiative sought to encourage the use of the new term and evangelize the principles it adhered to, commercial software vendors found themselves increasingly threatened by the concept of freely distributed software and universal access to applications source code. A Microsoft executive publicly stated in 2001 that open source is an intellectual property destroyer. I can't imagine something that could be worse than this for the software business and the intellectual property business. This view perfectly summarizes the initial response to FOSS by some software corporations. However, while FOSS has historically played a role outside of the mainstream of private software development, companies as large as Microsoft have begun to develop official open-source presences on the Internet. IBM, Oracle, Google and State Farm are just a few of the companies with a serious public stake in today's competitive open-source market. There has been a significant shift in the corporate philosophy concerning the development of free and open-source software. The free software movement was launched in 1983. In 1998, a group of individuals advocated that the term free software should be replaced by open source software as an expression which is less ambiguous and more comfortable for the corporate world. Software developers may want to publish their software with an open source license, so that anybody may also develop the same software or understand its internal functioning. With open source software, generally anyone is allowed to create modifications of it, port it to new operating systems and processor architectures, share it with others or, in some cases, market it. Scholars Caston and Ryan have pointed out several policy-based reasons for adoption of open source, in particular, the heightened value proposition from open source in the following categories: security, affordability, transparency, perpetuity, interoperability, flexibility, localization, particularly in the context of local governments. Casson and Ryan argue that governments have an inherent responsibility and fiduciary duty to taxpayers, which includes the careful analysis of these factors when deciding to purchase proprietary software or implement an open-source option. The open source definition, notably, presents an open source philosophy, and further defines the terms of usage, modification and redistribution of open source software. Software licenses grant rights to users which would otherwise be reserved by copyright law to the copyright holder. Several open source software licenses have qualified within the boundaries of the open source definition. The most prominent and popular example is the GNU General Public License, which allows free distribution under the condition that further developments and applications are put under the same license, thus also free. While open source distribution presents a way to make the source code of a product publicly accessible, the open source licenses allow the authors to fine-tune such access. The open source label came out of a strategy session held on April 7, 1998 in Palo Alto in reaction to Netscape's January 1998 announcement of a source code release for Navigator. A group of individuals at the session included Tim O'Reilly, Linus Torvalds, Tom Paquin, Jamie Zawinski, Larry Wall, Brian Behlendorf, Samir Parekh, Eric Holman, Greg Olson, Paul Vixie, John Ousterhout, Guido van Rossum, Philip Zimmerman, John Gilmore and Eric S. Raymond. They used the opportunity before the release of Navigator's source code to clarify a potential confusion caused by the ambiguity of the word free in English. Many people claimed that the birth of the Internet, since 1969, started the open source movement, while others do not distinguish between open source and free software movements. The Free Software Foundation, started in 1985, intended the word free to mean freedom to distribute and not freedom from cost. Since a great deal of free software already was free of charge, such free software became associated with zero cost, which seemed anti-commercial. The Open Source Initiative was formed in February 1998 by Eric S. Raymond and Bruce Perens, with at least 20 years of evidence from case histories of closed software development versus open development already provided by the Internet developer community. The OSI presented the open source case to commercial businesses, like Netscape. The OSI hoped that the usage of the label open source, a term suggested by Peterson of the Foresight Institute at the strategy session, would eliminate ambiguity, particularly for individuals who perceive free software as anti-commercial. They sought to bring a higher profile to the practical benefits of freely available source code, and they wanted to bring major software businesses and other high-tech industries into open source. Perens attempted to register open source as a service mark for the OSI, but that attempt was impractical by trademark standards. Meanwhile, due to the presentation of Raymond's paper to the upper management at Netscape, Raymond only discovered when he read the press release. Definitions. The Open Source Initiative's definition is recognized as the standard or de facto definition. Eric S. Raymond and Bruce Perens formed the organization in February 1998. With about 20 years of evidence from case histories of closed and open development already provided by the Internet, OSI continued to present the open source case to commercial businesses. They sought to bring a higher profile to the practical benefits of freely available source code, and wanted to bring major software businesses and other high-tech industries into open source. OSI uses the open source definition to determine whether it considers a software license open source. The definition was based on the Debian Free Software Guidelines, written and adapted primarily by Perens. Perens did not base his writing on the Four Freedoms of Free Software from the Free Software Foundation, which were only widely available later. Under Perens' definition, open source describes a broad general type of software license that makes source code available to the general public with relaxed or non-existent copyright restrictions. The principles, as stated, say absolutely nothing about trademark or patent use and require absolutely no cooperation to ensure that any common audit or release regime applies to any derived works. It is an explicit feature of open source that it may put no restrictions on the use or distribution by any organization or user. It forbids this, in principle, to guarantee continued access to derived works even by the major original contributors, despite initially accepting it. Richard Stallman of the FSF now flatly opposes the term open source being applied to what they refer to as free software. Although it is clear that legally free software does qualify as open source, Stallman considers that the category is abusive. Critics also oppose the professed pragmatism of the open source initiative, as they fear that the free software ideals of freedom and community are threatened by compromising on the FSF's idealistic standards for software freedom. The FSF considers free software to be a subset of open source software, and Richard Stallman carefully elaborated that DRM software, for example, can be developed as open source, despite that it does not give its users freedom, and thus doesn't qualify as free software. Open source software licensing. A license defines the rights and obligations that a licensor grants to a licensee. Open source licenses grant licensees the right to copy, modify, and redistribute source code. These licenses may also impose obligations. Authors initially derive a right to grant a license to their work based on the legal theory that upon creation of a work the author owns the copyright in that work. What the author, licensor, is granting when they grant a license to copy, modify, and redistribute their work is the right to use the author's copyrights. The author still retains ownership of those copyrights. The licensee simply is allowed to use those rights, as granted in the license, so long as they maintain the obligations of the license. The author does have the option to sell, assign, versus license their exclusive right to the copyrights to their work, whereupon the new owner, assignee, controls the copyrights. The ownership of the copyright is separate and distinct from the ownership of the work. A person can own a copy of a piece of code without the rights to copy, modify, or redistribute copies of it. When an author contributes code to an open source project, they do so under an explicit license or an implicit license. Some open source projects do not take contributed code under a license, but actually require assignment of the author's copyright in order to accept code contributions into the project. Placing code in the public domain is a way of waiving an author's copyrights in that work. No license is granted, and none is needed, to copy, modify, or redistribute a work in the public domain. Examples of free software license. Open source licenses include Apache license, BSD license, GNU General Public License, GNU Lesser General Public License, MIT license, Eclipse Public License, and Mozilla Public License. The proliferation of open source licenses is one of the few negative aspects of the open source movement because it is often difficult to understand the legal implications of the differences between licenses. With more than 180,000 open source projects available and its more than 1,400 unique licenses, the complexity of deciding how to manage open source usage within closed source commercial enterprises have dramatically increased. Some are homegrown while others are modeled after mainstream FOSS licenses such as Berkeley Software Distribution, Apache, MIT style, or GNU General Public License. In view of this, open source practitioners are starting to use classification schemes in which FOSS licenses are grouped. An important legal milestone for the open source free software movement was passed in 2008, when the U.S. Federal Appeals Court ruled that free software licenses definitely do set legally binding conditions on the use of copyrighted work, and they are therefore enforceable under existing copyright law. As a result, if end users do violate the licensing conditions, their license disappears, meaning they are infringing copyright. Certification can help to build higher user confidence. Certification could be applied to the simplest component that can be used by developers to build the simplest module to a whole software system. There have been numerous institutions evolving in this area of open-source software, including the International Institute of Software Technology, United Nations University, UNU. IIST is a non-profit research and education institution of the United Nations. It is currently involved in a project known as the Global Desktop Project. This project aims to build a desktop interface that every end user is able to understand and interact with, thus crossing the language and cultural barriers. It is drawing huge attention from parties involved in areas ranging from application development to localization. Furthermore, this project will improve developing nations' access to information systems. UNU. IIST aims to achieve this without any compromise in the quality of the software. It believes a global standard can be maintained by introducing certifications and is currently organizing conferences in order to explore frontiers in the field. Alternatively, assurance models have already solved the certification approach for software. This approach is tailorable and can be applied to us, but only if the requisite planning and execution, design, test and traceability artifacts are generated.